If your father served in the Pacific, he came home with silences. There were things he would not talk about. Things he saw on beaches your mother could not pronounce. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Places with names that sounded almost peaceful when spoken. So far from the coral and the heat and the smell of the jungles where the fighting happened. He never told you what happened there. Most of them never did. But the men on the other side, the Japanese soldiers who faced him across the sand, they left behind their own record. In diaries recovered from bodies in the mud. In letters home that never reached their family. In interrogation reports that stayed classified in American archives for 50 years. In memoirs written decades later, when the men who had survived tried, at the end of their lives, to explain what they had seen. There was a word Japanese wartime propaganda used for the Americans and the British. Kichiku Beye. It appeared on posters. It was shouted at rallies. It meant devil beast Americans in English, and it was official state language, designed to make the enemy inhuman. But something happened to that word as the war went on. In the diaries of Japanese soldiers who had actually fought the American Marines, the word began to change. It stopped being a slogan. It became something quieter, something more precise. It became the word they reached for when they needed to explain to themselves why the men across from them kept advancing when every principle of war they had been taught said those men should be dead or broken or retreat. Kichiku, in the mouth of a Japanese soldier who had actually faced the American Marine Corps, was not an insult. It was a confession. A confession that they had encountered something they could not explain in the language of soldiers. This is the story of what they were trying. And it begins in a room in Tokyo in the summer of 1942, where staff officers of the Imperial General Headquarters sat around a long lacquered table and asked themselves a question they could not. Who exactly were these people? Not the American Army. The American Army they understood. It was a conventional force with conventional doctrines that would respond to conventional pressures. They had studied it. They had fought it in the Philippines. They had beaten it. But this other branch, this smaller stranger service that kept appearing in the intelligence reports coming out of the South Pacific, this thing called the United States Marine Corps, this was something else. The officers in Tokyo did not yet know that the answer to their question would take 3 years to arrive, and would arrive in the form of an empire in ruins. They only knew that the reports from a place called Guadalcanal did not make sense. You may know a man who was there, maybe your father-in-law, maybe an uncle who came to Thanksgiving dinner every year and never spoke a word. Maybe there was a photograph you saw once, tucked away in a shoebox in the attic, a young man in a uniform, thin-tanned, standing next to a coconut palm on some island, whose name he would not say out loud. That man was one of them. That silence was where this story. To understand what these men were about to face, you have to understand what the Japanese thought they knew. And what they thought they knew was that the Japanese Empire in the summer of 1942 was invincible. 6 months earlier, they had done something no Asian nation had ever done. They had shattered the Western empires in a single continuous offensive that stretched from the beaches of Malaya to the mountains of Burma, from the harbors of Hong Kong to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. They had taken Singapore, the great British fortress in the east, in 70 days. 70 days. The British had built that fortress over decades and called it impregnable, and the Japanese army had walked through it as if the walls were made of paper. In the Philippines, they had driven out the Americans. General Douglas MacArthur, that towering figure with his corncob pipe and his hollow proclamations, had fled to Australia, leaving behind 75,000 men to surrender at Bataan and march to their deaths on roads that would become a byway. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched from the borders of India to the outer edges of the Aleutian Islands. It was the largest empire ever assembled by an Asian power. It had been built in 6 months. The men who built it were not amateurs. They were veterans. Many of them had been fighting in China since 1937. 5 years of continuous campaigning in some of the most brutal conditions any modern army had ever faced. They had crossed rivers under fire. They had stormed cities. They had learned to fight in mud and rain and disease. They believed, as their doctrine taught them, that spiritual intensity could overcome any material disadvantage. That the Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, was a weapon no Western army could. That when the moment of decision came, the willingness to die would defeat the mere willing. They had reasons to believe this. Everything they had encountered so far had confirmed it. And then, on the 7th of August, 1942, the reports began arriving from a place none of them had bothered to memorize: Guadalcanal. It was a small, sweltering island in the Solomon Chain, 130 miles long, 30 miles wide, covered in triple canopy jungle so thick that sunlight barely reached the... The Japanese had begun building an airstrip there in July, a rudimentary thing hacked out of the kunai grass by Korean laborers and a small garrison of construction troops. Kunai grass, tall, sharp, sword-like blades that cut through skin like paper. Men who crawled through it left blood on the ground. The Japanese had not expected the Americans to know, and even if the Americans noticed, they had not expected them to act. But at dawn on the 7th of August, some 19,000 American Marines landed in the Solomon Islands that morning. Roughly 11,000 of them came ashore on Guadalcanal itself, splashing through the surf, dragging equipment through the sand, disappearing into a jungle that within days would begin trying to kill them just as effectively as any human. The Japanese garrison, small and unprepared, melted into the interior. The Marines seized the airstrip, renamed it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, and began digging in. The response from the Imperial Navy was swift and catastrophic. On the night of the 8th of August, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped through the Allied screen off South. In less than 40 minutes, the most one-sided naval engagement of the 20th century, they sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers. 3 American, 1 Australian. Over 1,000 sailors died in dark water, most of them never saw. The transports still offloading supplies to the Marines pulled out before dawn, taking with them most of the food, most of the ammunition, and most of the heavy equipment the landing force had been counting. The American Marines on Guadalcanal were alone, cut off, undersupplied, surrounded by a jungle that would kill them slowly through disease and rot. And now, according to every reasonable military calculation, ripe for destruction. The Japanese planners in Rabaul, the great forward base on New Britain, looked at this situation and drew what seemed the obvious conclusion. The Americans had made a serious... They had committed to a position they could not hold. All that was required was to push them back into the sea before they could consolidate. A few thousand troops, a coordinated attack. The airstrip would be recovered by autumn. The man they chose to do it was named Kiyonao Ichiki. Colonel Ichiki was 50 years old, a career officer, a veteran of the fighting in China, where he had earned a reputation for aggression and unshakable belief in the doctrine of the offensive. He commanded the 28th Infantry Regiment, an elite unit that had trained for the invasion of Midway, and now, with Midway a strategic disaster, found itself redirected to a jungle island most of the men could not have located on a map 2 months. Ichiki was told the Americans on Guadalcanal numbered perhaps 2,000 men. Demoralized, undersupplied, cut off from reinforcement. He was given roughly 900 men from his regiment as an advance echelon. He was told to attack as soon as he landed. He did not question the intelligence. He did not wait for the rest of his regiment. He did not conduct proper reconnaissance. He believed, as his training had taught him to believe, that the sudden application of maximum aggression would shatter an enemy already close to breaking. He believed that spiritual intensity would defeat mere numbers. He believed the Americans would run. On the night of the 21st of August, 1942, Colonel Ichiki led approximately 900 men across a narrow sandbar at the mouth of a river the American Marines were calling the Tenaru, though its actual name was the Ichiki. He had no idea what was waiting for him. On the other side of that sandbar, dug into positions they had been improving for nearly 2 weeks, were the men of the 1st Marine Division. They had strung wire. They had positioned machine guns to interlock their fields of fire across the sand. They had prepared in that specific, patient, professional way that would come to define every American Marine engagement of the Pacific War to receive an attack. Ichiki gave the order shortly after midnight. His men rose from the tree line and began to run. The sandbar was perhaps 100 yards wide. The moon was up. The American Marines could see them coming. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The machine guns opened up first, cutting horizontal lanes across the sandbar at a range so close the American Marines could see the individual expressions on the faces of the men. Orders followed. Rifle fire from the flanks. The Marines had positioned everything they had to converge on that single narrow crossing. And everything they had converged. Wave after wave came across that sandbar. 3 separate charges over the course of the night. Each one absorbed, each one broken, each one leaving behind more Japanese dead than the last, until the sandbar itself was carpeted with bodies, and the water at either side ran discolored in the pale dawn light. By morning, of the 900 men Colonel Ichiki had led across the Ilu River, more than 750 were dead. American Marine casualties totaled 34 killed and 75 wounded. The smell after was the smell no one who was there ever forgot. Cordite, burned grass, the sweet iron smell of blood in warm sand, and beneath it all the swamp rot of the tropical jungle. Some of the Marines who survived that night would tell you 60 years later that they could still smell it. Ichiki himself, watching his regiment destroyed in front of him, retreated to the edge of the jungle. He burned his regimental colors, the sacred banner that in Japanese military tradition was worth more than any man's life. Then he took his own life. But here is where the story turns. Here is the first thing the men in Tokyo did not know. The full scale of the Ichiki disaster was not reported honestly to Imperial General Head. The staff officers at Rabaul, the men who had planned the attack and chosen the intelligence estimates and dispatched Ichiki with insufficient force, understood what a complete accounting of the Tenaru would mean for their careers and their command, so they softened it. They described the engagement as a reconnaissance in force that had encountered unexpected resistance. They downplayed the casualty figures. They did not mention that an experienced colonel had committed suicide over the destruction of his regiment. The result was that the next wave of Japanese commanders sent against Guadalcanal received essentially the same intelligence briefing Ichiki had received. American numbers underestimated. American morale assumed to be crumbling. American training and doctrine assessed as inferior to Japanese fighting spirit. They walked into the same trap, because they had been told there was no trap. This is the first thing you need to understand about what was happening in the Pacific in the summer of 1942. It was not simply that the Japanese were losing battles. It was that they were losing them in a way their own institution refused to see. And every failure of institutional honesty at Rabaul purchased another wave of dead men on some jungle beach 1,000 miles from home. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, the men who had just annihilated Ichiki's regiment were doing something the Japanese did not yet understand. They were adjusting, they were adapting. They were not, in fact, the demoralized, undersupplied force the intelligence reports had described. They were something the Japanese had never fought. And to understand what they were, you have to go back 20 years to a series of arguments in Washington that had almost destroyed the United States Marine Corps entirely. After the First World War, the American military establishment had looked at its Marine Corps and asked a simple question. What was it for? The Army had infantry. The Navy had ships. The Marines were a small service, expensive to maintain, with no obvious mission that the other branches could not perform. Powerful voices in Washington argued that the Corps should be absorbed into the Army or disbanded entirely. The American Marines fought back the only way an institution can fight for its own survival. They found a mission no one else wanted. They chose the seizure of fortified islands. In the 1920s, this was considered a fool's mission. The last major amphibious assault in modern military history had been Gallipoli in 1915. And Gallipoli had been a catastrophe of such magnitude that most military theorists had concluded that opposed landings against a defended shore were simply impossible. The defender would always have the advantage. The attacker would always be cut down at the waterline. It could not be done. The American Marines decided to prove it could be done. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, while the rest of the American military assumed the next war would be fought on the plains of Europe, a small group of Marine officers built, from nothing, the entire doctrine of modern amphibious war. They studied Gallipoli in obsessive detail. A man named Lieutenant Colonel Earl Ellis wrote a document in 1921 called Operation Plan 712 that laid out 20 years in advance exactly how the Marine Corps would fight its way across the Pacific if a war with Japan ever came. Ellis died in mysterious circumstances in the Palau Islands in 1923, possibly while conducting personal reconnaissance of the very islands his plan predicted would need to be assaulted. He never saw his ideas proven right. The Marines designed specialized landing craft. They developed coordinated naval gunfire support techniques. They trained for beach assaults on the sand of Culebra and Vieques over and over again in conditions that other services considered too extreme for realistic exercises. They built a system, and they built the kind of men who could execute that system not by command from above, but by trained instinct in each individual Marine. In August of 1942, the men in Tokyo did not know any of this. They only knew that a Japanese regiment had been destroyed on a sandbar by a force they did not understand, and that they needed to send more men, better men in greater numbers, with better commanders and better plans. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, studied the reports from the Tenaru with the seriousness they deserved. He adjusted his estimate of the American Marine defenders upward. He selected a new commander. He assembled a larger force. The man he chose was Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, 50 years old, another veteran of the fighting in China, a more careful officer than Ichiki, more inclined to reconnaissance and preparation. Kawaguchi was given approximately 6,000 men in his brigade and told to attack Henderson Field in a coordinated three-pronged assault that would strike the American Marine perimeter from three directions simultaneously. It was, on paper, a much better plan. Kawaguchi would land on the coast at night. He would march his forces through the jungle for days, avoiding contact and position them for a synchronized attack. He would strike where the American Marines least expected. He would use surprise, deception, and simultaneous pressure to shatter the defense. He did not know that the terrain he had chosen for his approach was the worst possible terrain for a coordinated triple canopy jungle. No landmarks, no usable maps. His three columns became separated within hours of leaving the coast, and they never fully coordinated again. He did not know that the ridge he had selected as his main objective would be defended by one of the finest units in the entire America. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion, reinforced by the 1st Parachute, approximately 800 men. 3,000 men would strike that ridge in the main assault. 800 waited for them. None of them slept. By any reasonable calculation, Kawaguchi's men should have overwhelmed that ridge in the first hour of the attack. They had surprise, they had numbers, they had the momentum of desperation. What they did not have was any idea what kind of men were waiting for them in the dark. The ridge had no name yet. It was a narrow spine of coral and kunai grass, rising 250 feet above the jungle floor, running roughly north to south along the southern approaches to Henderson Field. The dirt beneath the grass was thin, hard, difficult to dig in. There were no trees at the crest, only exposed ground, and the men who held that ridge could see for miles. They could also be seen. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson understood what he had been given. 45 years old, a New Englander by birth, quiet in manner, precise in speech. He had come to the Marines during the First World War and never left. He had fought in Nicaragua chasing bandits through jungles that had taught him things about small unit combat. Most officers never learned. He had trained his raiders for exactly this kind of engagement. Close terrain, confused command, situations where the fundamental question was not who had the better plan, but whose men could keep functioning when the plan disintegrated. He walked that ridge for 2 days before Kawaguchi. He walked it in the mornings when the mist still clung to the grass. He walked it in the afternoons when the sun beat down hard enough to make the coral shimmer. He memorized the folds of the terrain. He positioned his machine guns to interlock their fire across every approach a man could reasonably use. He personally sighted each of his mortar tubes. His men dug in, not deep. There was no time to dig deep, but enough to give a rifleman a fighting hole and enough overhead cover to survive an artillery airburst. They strung barbed wire in front of the positions. They cleared fields of fire in the grass. They ran telephone lines between platoons that would be cut within the first hour of the battle and would have to be repaired under fire over and over through the entire night. Major General Kawaguchi's approach march had gone worse than he understood. His columns had become separated in the jungle within the first days of leaving the beach. His communication had broken down. His men were exhausted, dehydrated, running low on the rice they carried in cloth bags slung across their bodies. Some had already died of heat exhaustion before firing a shot. But Kawaguchi was still confident. He was still a veteran. He still believed, as his doctrine taught him, that the first assault at night, delivered with maximum aggression and surprise, would break the American line. He had done this before in China. He knew how it worked. The attack began on the evening of the 12th of September. It came in waves. Japanese infantry rose from the jungle and charged uphill through the kunai grass, screaming, firing as they ran. The American Marine machine guns opened up at close range. Men fell in the grass. More men came behind them. The attackers reached the wire, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and were cut down. The wave broke. The Marines held their fire. They waited. Another wave came, this time from a different angle. The Japanese had probed the line and identified what they believed was a weak point. They struck it with maximum force, and for a moment it worked. The line bent. Marines fell back. Japanese infantry poured through the gap. And then something happened that Kawaguchi's men had not been prepared. The American Marines behind the breach did not panic. They did not fall back further. They did not wait for orders. They turned and attacked into the flanks of the men who had just broken through, cutting them off from their reinforcements, isolating them in the darkness. Within minutes, the penetration had been sealed up, and the Japanese infantry who had made it through the line found themselves alone in the grass, hunted by squads of Marines operating without communication, without officers, without any direction other than the training that had been ground into them for years. Kawaguchi did not know this yet. He was back in the jungle, listening to the radio traffic, trying to make sense of reports that made no sense. His forward units were reporting success, then reporting they had lost contact, then reporting they were being attacked from behind, from the flanks, from directions the enemy could not possibly be attacking from because the enemy was in front of him. He ordered another wave, then another, then another. By dawn on the 14th of September, the ridge was covered in bodies, Japanese bodies mostly, some American Marines. The kunai grass had been trampled flat in wide arcs where men had died in groups. The wire was choked with dead. The Marine machine guns had barrels so hot the crews were pouring canteen water on them to keep them functioning. And still the attacks came on and off through 2 nights of fighting. There is a striking thing about the Japanese survivor accounts of Edson's Ridge, and it is not what they said, it is what they could not say. In the interrogation reports and post-war interviews, in the diaries of officers who lived through it, the surviving Japanese struggled again and again to describe what had happened to them on that ridge. Their language failed. They fell back on words like impossible, incomprehensible, wrong. They tried to explain how their attacks had broken against a defense that seemed to move as they moved, that seemed to anticipate them, that seemed to be run by no one and everyone at the same time. They could not put it into words. That failure of language is itself the historical record. It is the sound of professionals encountering something outside the frame of their training and finding that their vocabulary, built for a different kind of war, was inadequate to describe what they had just survived. By the end of the fighting, Kawaguchi had lost more than 700 men killed and hundreds more wounded. His force was combat ineffective. He ordered a withdrawal back into the interior of the island, and the retreat became its own catastrophe as exhausted, wounded men died in the jungle from injuries they might have survived with prompt care. Edson lost approximately 80 American Marines killed and roughly 130 wounded. The ridge held. Henderson Field held. The American Marines called it Edson's Ridge from that day forward. The Japanese called it something else. They called it Bloody Ridge. They called it the place where the doctrine failed. The reports that traveled back to Rabaul and then to Tokyo were more honest this time. There was no way to hide what had happened. A Japanese major general had led thousands of men against 800 American Marines and had been decisively defeated. Something was wrong with the assumptions. The staff officers began to look at the American Marines differently. They began to study. In the intelligence assessments that circulated at Imperial General Headquarters through late 1942 and into 1943, a pattern of concern emerges from the surviving Japanese analysts noted with growing precision that the American Marines fought differently from the American Army units they had faced in the Philippines. They noted that Marine units continued to function tactically after their command structures were disrupted. They noted that Marine defensive positions could not be easily broken by the massed frontal attacks that Japanese doctrine had been built around. They noted, above all, that the Marines did not seem to break under the psychological conditions that Japanese doctrine had assumed would break any Western force. What Japanese intelligence was describing, without knowing quite what to call it, was the product of Marine training philosophy. The American Marine Corps did not train men to execute plans. The American Marine Corps trained men to function when plans failed. Every drill, every field exercise, every classroom hour was built around the assumption that at some point in any real combat situation, the officer would be dead, the radio would be destroyed, the flanks would, and the individual Marine at the squad and fire team level would have to make immediate tactical decisions with no guidance from above. So the Marines trained for that. They trained for it obsessively. They trained until the individual private, standing alone in a jungle at 3 a.m. with his squad leader dead and his sergeant wounded, would know what to do next without being told. Kawaguchi's men had not been trained for that. They had been trained to execute the plan. When the plan collapsed, they did not have a substitute. They stood in the darkness, waiting for orders that would never come, while all around them Marines who needed no orders continued to fight. This was the pattern that would repeat itself for the next 3 years. And here is where the honest historical record diverges from the myth that later grew up around the Pacific. The Japanese did understand what was happening. They understood it far more clearly than post-war American narratives usually acknowledged. By late 1943, the Japanese High Command had begun taking measures that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. A formal directive was issued from Tokyo instructing field commanders to abandon the Banzai Charge. The mass frontal assault, the doctrine of spiritual intensity overwhelming material disadvantage, was to be replaced with defense in depth, cave systems, mutual fire support, and the maximum extraction of casualties from the attack. The directive was clear. Its logic was sound. It was based on painful, expensive lessons across a dozen island engagements, and it was in some places ignored, not everywhere, but by enough field commanders that its effects were blunted for enough. Because for many Japanese officers, especially the older ones, the Banzai Charge was not merely a task. It was an expression of the samurai code. It was the honorable death that a warrior chose when the alternative was surrender. Ordering their men to hunker down in caves and let the enemy come to them felt, to these officers, like a betrayal of everything they had been taught. They chose the frontal assault, again and again. And their men died on the beaches and the ridge lines because their commanders could not bring themselves to obey an order that violated the ancient code they had built their identity. This was the tragedy of institutional Japan, not that it lacked intelligence, not that it lacked warriors, but that its warriors and its intelligence were pointed in incompatible directions, and no directive from Tokyo could reconcile the contradiction. They had begun to understand, and it was the understanding that made them afraid. While all of this was happening, the American Marines kept coming. In November of 1943, they came to Tarawa. The atoll of Bedio was less than 2 miles long and barely 500 yards wide at its widest point. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki commanded its defense. He had roughly 4,800 men, though many of them were Korean laborers rather than combat. He had 14 coastal guns and 40 artillery pieces, and hundreds of machine gun positions connected by an elaborate system of trenches and bunkers reinforced with coconut logs and concrete. According to accounts that circulated after the war, Shibazaki is said to have told his garrison that the Americans could not take Bedio with 1 million men in 100 years. Whether he actually said those exact words is uncertain. What is certain is that the defensive system he built reflected that confidence. He was wrong, but not by very much. On the 20th of November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division began landing on Bedio, and immediately everything went wrong. The tides were lower than expected. The landing craft grounded on a coral reef 500 yards from the beach. American Marines stepped out of their boats into chest-deep water and began walking toward the shore across 500 yards of open lagoon under direct fire from every gun on the island. Men died in the water. They died in numbers that in the opening hours of the assault approached catastrophic levels. Radios were lost. Officers were killed before they could give a single order. Unit cohesion, which had been carefully constructed through months of training, dissolved within 30 minutes of the first Marine setting foot in that water. There was a young Marine on that reef named William Bordelon, 22 years old, born in San Antonio, Texas, a staff sergeant with a combat engineer platoon. His landing craft was destroyed by shell fire before he reached the beach. He waded through the water carrying explosive charges. He reached the seawall alone. He destroyed the first Japanese pillbox himself. Then a second. He was wounded and refused evacuation. He went back into the fight to help another Marine and destroyed another position and was killed by rifle fire as he was preparing to attack. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was one man on one beach. There were thousands like him. Most of them are buried in cemeteries you will never visit, in soil that is technically no longer American, on islands whose names you may not remember. And still the American Marines came forward, not in organized. Those structures had been destroyed in the water, in ones and twos and small groups, individual Marines and remnants of squads moving through the fire toward the beach for no reason that could be tactically calculated. Only trained, they did not stop. Shibazaki was killed on the first day when American naval gunfire hit his command bunker after a communications party was ordered out. The chain of command on Bidio disintegrated, but it did not matter. The Japanese defenders continued to fight from every position that still had a man alive to fire a weapon. 76 hours after the first American Marine set foot on the beach, Bidio was secured. Of roughly 4,800 defenders, more than 4,600 were dead. 17 Japanese soldiers surrendered, along with roughly 130 Korean laborers. American Marine casualties came to nearly 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in 76 hours of fighting. In the years after the war, when Japanese military historians studied the after-action reports and tried to make sense of what had happened, the official Japanese assessments came to a difficult conclusion. It was not that the Marines had achieved something. It was that Japanese defensive doctrine had been built around expectations about human behavior under fire that the American Marines did not fulfill. The defense had assumed that attackers taking catastrophic casualties in the water would break. They did not break. The defense had assumed that unit cohesion, once shattered, could not be reassembled in real time under enemy fire. The Marines reassembled it. The defense had assumed that a plan requires a functioning chain of command. The Marine plan did not seem to require one. The Japanese analysts had, in their careful post-war language, described the same thing Kawaguchi's survivors on Edson's Ridge had struggled to describe. They had built their defense around the wrong assumptions about what the enemy would do when things went wrong. They had built the wrong defense. If you had an uncle who came home from the Pacific and drank a little too much on the 4th of July, if there was a man in your neighborhood growing up who would not sit with his back to a door, if you knew someone who woke his wife in the middle of the night for years with dreams he would not describe in the morning, that was where the dreams came. From beaches like Bidio, from reefs like the one at Tarawa, from nights that did not end because the fighting did not stop. By 1944, an officer named Colonel Kunio Nakagawa was assigned command of the defense of Peleliu. He was 46 years old, careful, methodical. He had read every after-action report from every previous American Marine campaign available to him. He had studied Guadalcanal and Tarawa. He had internalized every mistake his predecessors had made. Nakagawa did not intend to make those mistakes. He forbade banzai charges. He ordered the construction of an elaborate cave system running through the coral ridges that dominated the. He established mutually supporting positions with overlapping fields of fire. He built defense in depth, in the modern professional sense, layers of resistance that would force the American Marines to fight for every yard of ground and pay maximum casualties for every yard they took. His defense was among the most sophisticated that Japan had constructed in the entire Pacific War to that point. It was the response of a professional to a professional adversary. It represented everything the Japanese Army had learned from 2 years of being on the receiving end of American Marine land. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu on the 15th of September, 19. The operation had been projected to last 4 days. The main fighting lasted more than 2 months. For those weeks, in temperatures that regularly exceeded 115 degrees, in terrain so rough that men broke bones simply moving across it, the American Marines ground their way through Nakagawa's defense. They took casualties at rates that in some units exceeded 50%. Whole companies were reduced to a handful of exhausted survivors. Whole battalions had to be pulled off the line and rebuilt with replacements before they could return to combat. There was a captain on Peleliu named Everett Pope, 25 years old, from Milton, Massachusetts, a graduate of Bowdoin College. commanded Company C of the 1st Marines. On the ridges of Peleliu, his company was ordered to seize a piece of high ground the American command believed. Roughly 90 men went up the hill with Captain Pope on the afternoon of the 19th of September. Through the night, waves of Japanese infantry attacked them over and over from multiple sides. By dawn, of the 90 men who had climbed the hill, only a handful were still capable of fighting. They had run out of grenades and were throwing rocks and empty ammunition cans down the slope to make the enemy head. When they were finally ordered off the hill, Captain Pope walked down with the survivors. He received the Medal of Honor. He lived a long life afterward. He died in 2009 at 90 years old, having spent the rest of his years quietly and refusing to speak much about the. He said once near the end that he had never understood why he was the one who came home. He said the other men on that hill had been just as good as he was. He said better. That was Peleliu. Not one company, not one hill. Weeks of that up and down every ridge on the island. But the American Marines did not stop. Nakagawa watched his defense do exactly what he had designed it to do. It killed Marines. Killed them in enormous numbers, and still they came, cave by cave, ridge by ridge, moving forward through terrain that no rational commander would have thought crossable under fire. On the 24th of November, 1944, with his forces destroyed and only a handful of men left, Colonel Nakagawa sent a final radio transmission to Japan. It was a code phrase, a signal that the defense had reached its end. The phrase he chose was Sakura, Sakura. Cherry blossom, cherry blossom. In the Japanese poetic tradition, the cherry blossom is the symbol of a life that falls at the height of its beauty, falling early, falling without regret. Earlier, in one of his last messages before the end, Nakagawa had reported to his headquarters that his sword was broken and he had run out of spear. He burned his regimental colors, and with the remaining officers of his staff, he took his own life. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. There is no long speech of Nakagawa's that survives from those last hours. No confession of admiration for the enemy. No neatly quotable summation of what he had learned about the American Marine. The truth is quieter and, in some ways, more terrible. Survives is a poem in code. The broken sword, the silence after the transmission ended. What survives is a professional Japanese officer who had built the best defense he knew how to build, watched it accomplish exactly what it was designed to accomplish, and still lost. Because the men attacking him had been trained for exactly this, and the training had held. By February of 1945, when the American Marines came to a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima, the pattern was set. Roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months constructing the most elaborate defensive system Japan would ever build. Miles of tunnels, hundreds of blockhouses, interlocking positions designed with a single purpose: to kill American Marines slowly, methodically, at maximum cost. Kuribayashi was an unusual Japanese officer. He had spent time in the United States and Canada in the late 1920s as a military attaché. He had ridden trains across the American Midwest. He had seen the factories. He had understood more clearly than most of his colleagues what industrial America was capable of when it decided to make war. He wrote letters home from Iwo Jima to his wife and children in the months before the American landing. Those letters, published after the war, are among the most human documents to come out of the Pacific War from the Japanese side. In them, he expressed love for his family. He gave practical advice about running the household in his absence. He spoke of small things. He did not speak of victory. He knew. He built his defense not to win, but to make the price of victory as high as it could be made. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. It was the only major Pacific battle in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. American Marines suffered nearly 26,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. Nearly 7,000 of them died. Kuribayashi's defense had achieved everything it had been designed. And still, at the end of 36 days, Iwo Jima belonged to the American Marines. There was a Marine who came ashore on Iwo Jima on the morning of the 19th of February, 1945, whose name you may recognize. John Basilone, a gunnery sergeant, 28 years old, from Raritan, New Jersey. He had already won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal 2.5 years earlier for holding a machine gun position against wave after wave of Japanese attacks through a single terrible night. The Marine Corps had brought him home. They had used him for war bond drives. They had put him on stages and had him shake hands with movie stars. He could have spent the rest of the war safe in the United States, giving speeches, married to the woman who had become his wife. He asked to go back. He was told he did not have to. He said he wanted to. He said his place was with his men. He got on the ships. He came ashore on Iwo Jima on the morning of the invasion. He was killed that same morning, roughly an hour after the landing. He was 28 years old. He had been married for less than a year. His widow, Lena, never remarried. She lived until 1999. She was buried at her own request, wearing the wedding ring John had given her. That was one Marine on one beach. There were tens of thousands like him. By the time American forces reached Okinawa in April of 1945, the pattern had been set. The Japanese defenders knew what they were facing. Their intelligence assessments were, by this point, unflinchingly honest. They knew they could not win. They knew they could only impose cost. There was one man among the senior Japanese officers on Okinawa who had thought most carefully about that cost. His name was Hiromi. And on a quiet evening in 1972, 27 years after the war ended, he sat down at a desk in Japan and finally wrote down what he had seen. He was 42 years old in the spring of 1945, a colonel, a staff officer, the senior operations planner for the 32nd Army defending the island of Okinawa. He was thin, quiet, professorial in his manner. He wore round glasses that gave him the look of a schoolteacher more than a soldier. He had spent his career studying warfare rather than fighting it directly, and he had come to Okinawa with a specific idea about how the coming battle. He was almost the only senior officer on the island who understood what was coming. Okinawa was going to be different. Yahara knew this. The Americans were assembling the largest amphibious force in the history of the Pacific, more than 1,500 ships, nearly 500,000 men. 2 American Marine divisions, the 1st and the 6th, alongside 4 armies, was the culmination of everything the Marines had learned across 3 years of island fighting, and it was arriving on the doorstep of the Japanese home islands themselves. Yahara did not believe Okinawa could be held. He believed it could be made expensive. His plan was defense in depth, withdraw from the beaches. Do not contest the land. Let the Americans come ashore unopposed and consume their supplies moving in. Then, at the great defensive line built along the southern ridges of the island, hold as long as possible. Bleed the enemy, buy time. Every day of resistance on Okinawa was a day of preparation for the defense of the home islands. Every American casualty here was one that would not be available for the invasion of Kichiku. It was tactically the right plan. It was what Nakagawa had done at Peleliu, refined and scaled up for a much larger island. It represented the mature Japanese response to the American Marine assault doctrine. Absorb the blow, extract the price. Do not throw away lives in gestures that felt honorable but achieved nothing. His superior officer disagreed. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho was the chief of staff of the 32nd. He was a firebrand, a believer, a man whose career had been built on aggressive spirit and offensive doctrine. He had been present at some of the darker chapters of the Japanese conduct in China, and he carried into every meeting the absolute conviction that Japanese soldiers were meant to attack. Cho looked at Yahara's plan and saw a violation of the Japanese warrior spirit. He believed the 32nd Army must launch a great counterattack, a massive coordinated offensive that would drive the Americans back to the beaches and, if it could not throw them into the sea, would at least demonstrate that the samurai spirit had not died. He argued for it in every planning meeting. He pushed for it in every briefing. He wore down the resistance of the Army commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. Ushijima was a decent man, a career officer, thoughtful, respected. He was caught between his operations officer, who had the correct plan, and his chief of staff, who had the passion of absolute belief. In early May of 1945, against Yahara's specific and detailed objection, Ushijima authorized the great counter. It was, as Yahara had predicted, a catastrophe. The offensive was launched on the night of the 4th of May. Japanese forces attacked out of their prepared positions and moved forward into open ground. American artillery had been waiting for exactly this. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore joined in. American Marine and Army units on the receiving end of the assault held their positions and poured fire into the attacking formation. And by the morning of the 5th of May, the offensive had failed completely. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The elaborate defensive positions that had taken months to prepare were now half emptied of the men who had been meant to defend them. The initiative, which had been Japan's only remaining asset, was gone. Yahara sat in the command bunker on the night the reports came. He did not say "I told you," did not need to. He simply resumed his work, calculating how much time the 32nd Army had left, planning the phased withdrawals that would extract maximum cost from the American advance across the remaining ground. Ushijima came to him privately, days later. He acknowledged quietly that Yahara had been right. He accepted responsibility for the decision. He also gave Yahara an order. He ordered him to live. Ushijima explained his reasoning quietly. Someone had to survive this. Someone had to bear witness to what the 32nd Army had faced and to what it had learned before it was too late for the rest. Ushijima had chosen Yahara because Yahara was thoughtful, because he had understood the situation correctly from the beginning, and because he possessed the calm intellectual honesty required to write down what he had seen without distortion. Yahara accepted the order. He would have preferred to die with the rest. But an order was an order, and this one had a purpose. On the 22nd of June 1945, in the command cave at Mabuni on the southern tip of Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and Lieutenant General Isamu Cho committed suicide. Yahara, following his orders, attempted to make his way northward through American lines in civilian clothes. Captured, he spent time as a prisoner of war, and then he came home to Japan, and after many years he sat down and he began to write. His memoir was published in Japan in 1972. It was translated into English in 1995 under the title The Battle for Okinawa. It is a careful, unsentimental military document. It is the closest thing that exists to an honest professional assessment by a senior Japanese officer of what the 32nd Army had faced on Okinawa and why. Yahara did not write flowery praise of the American Marines. That is not the kind of book he wrote. What he did was more valuable. He described in precise operational language what the Marines had done, and he explained, without excuse or self-pity, why the defensive plans he had helped design had not been able to stop them. He wrote of Marines who advanced across ground that no rational commander should have committed troops. He wrote of Marine units that absorbed catastrophic casualties and continued their attacks the next morning, as though nothing had happened. He wrote of positions the 32nd Army had believed to be impregnable that had fallen anyway, taken by small groups of Marines operating on their own initiative when their officers were dead or wounded. He wrote, above all, of a professional respect for what he had faced. Not admiration, not affection. The Marines had killed his friends and destroyed his army, but respect in the specific and demanding sense that one professional owes to another when the other has proven to be, in the specific work at hand, better than he was. The Japanese called them Kichiku, devil. In the beginning on the propaganda posters, it had been a slow. By the end, in the diaries and the private writings and the careful post-war memoirs, it had become something else. It had become the word Japanese soldiers reached for when they had nothing else, when their doctrine had failed, when their defenses, when the men they had been told were soft and undisciplined and unwilling to die, kept coming, and would not stop. There is a photograph most Americans have seen. 6 American Marines raising a flag on Mount Suribachi on the 23rd of February, 1945. It was taken by an Associated Press photographer named Joe Rosenthal on the 5th day of the battle for Iwo Jima. It became one of the defining images of the entire 20th century. It has been reproduced on postage stamps, on posters, on the Great Bronze Memorial in Arlington that Americans visit to remember what their country did during the years of the Second World War. Most people who see it think it is a picture of victory. It is not. The battle for Iwo Jima did not end when that flag went up. It went on for another month. Of the 6 men in the photograph, 3 would be dead before the battle was over. Sergeant Michael Strank, killed by American shell fire on the 1st of March. Corporal Harlan Block, killed by a mortar round the same day. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, shot by a Japanese sniper on the 21st of March. The photograph did not capture a moment of triumph. It captured a moment during a fight. The men in it were doing something that needed to be done in a place that was still trying to kill. And they were doing it because doing it was what their training had taught them to do when the situation called. The fact that the situation was still trying to kill them was not a reason to stop. It was simply a condition to be managed. This is what the Japanese saw across 3 years and dozens of islands. Men who treated being in places that were trying to kill them as simply a condition to be managed. Not men who were unafraid. Fear is biological. Even the finest training in the world cannot remove fear from the human body. The American Marine Corps did not try. What it did instead was prepare men at the deepest level of institutional formation to act correctly in the presence of fear, to function through, to carry the mission forward regardless of what the environment was doing. That was what the Japanese officers were describing in their reports. Not superhuman warriors. Men who had been shaped by an institution that knew exactly what it was building for and had taken the building seriously enough to do it right. There is a temptation when telling a story like this to make it into something it is not, to make it into a celebration. There is a war memoirist named Eugene Sledge, an American Marine who fought at Peleliu and Okinawa, who wrote about his experiences in a book called With the Old Breed. It is one of the great honest documents of the Pacific War. And Sledge did not spare the American Marines the truth about themselves. He wrote about Marines who collected gold teeth from Japanese dead, sometimes from Japanese wounded who were still alive. He wrote about Marines who took skulls as trophies and boiled the flesh off them and sent them home. He wrote about the deep, permanent hatred that had settled into the men fighting in the Pacific, a hatred that on both sides had erased the possibility of surrender and turned every engagement into a war of extermination. There were American Marines who committed atrocities. There were Marines who shot men trying to surrender. There were Marines who committed acts that in any other war would have been prosecuted as war crimes, and that in this war were simply what happened when men had been fighting in the jungle for too long against an enemy who fought without quarter and expected nothing. The historian John Dower called it war without mercy. He did not exaggerate. It was on both sides, and the professional excellence of the American Marines that Yahara described in his memoir did not include mercy toward the enemy. It included the professional application of maximum violence toward the accomplishment of the mission. That was what they had been trained for. That was what they did. This is not a story about angels. It is a story about men who had been shaped into instruments of a particular kind, and who had performed that warfare with a level of institutional competence that their enemy, who had committed atrocities of his own on a scale that dwarfed anything the American Marines did in the Pacific, was forced to acknowledge as beyond his ability to counter. Both things are true. The American Marines were what Yahara said they were, and Sledge was telling the truth about them too. War does not permit clean stories. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What is worth remembering, though, is what the honest men on both sides came to understand. Nakagawa understood. When his sword was broken and his spears were gone, he sent his poem in code and he ended. He did not need to explain further. His silence, the silence of a professional soldier at the end of a defense he had built, as well as he knew how, is its own testimony. Yahara understood it. When he sat down 27 years later to write his careful memoir, he did not offer easy praise. He offered something rare. He offered the honest professional judgment of a defeated staff officer describing an enemy who had been, in the specific discipline of amphibious assault, better than the army he had helped command, and the countless Japanese soldiers whose diaries were found in the mud, whose letters were pulled from the pockets of the dead, whose voices come down to us only in fragments in the interrogation reports. They understood it too. They did not understand it in words. They understood it in the failure of their language to describe what they had seen. In the propaganda word Kichiku that came in the end to mean something the propagandists had never intended, not an insult, a confession. What had happened to the Japanese army in the Pacific was that it had encountered the product of an institution that had spent 20 years solving a specific problem, not a legend, not a mythology, an institution. Set of practices and selections and doctrines and traditions that had been built and refined and tested until the result was men who could function at the tactical level when everything above them had been destroyed. Men who did not need officers to think for them. Men who carried the mission forward through fear and exhaustion and casualties because the mission had been placed inside them, so deeply that it operated below the level of conscious thought. That is the story the Japanese record tells, not the story of demons, not the story of devil dogs, though that is a phrase the American Marines gave to themselves after another war in another century. The story of an institution, and of what an institution can build when it knows precisely what it is building for and takes the works seriously enough to do it right over decades of patient effort. The old men who remember are dying now. The American Marines who crossed those beaches, if any are still with us, are in their late 90s or older. The Japanese soldiers who faced them are almost all gone. The generation that lived this story is passing into history, and soon there will be no one left who can tell it from personal memory. But the record remains, the reports, the diaries, the interrogations, the memoirs written years afterward by men who had time to think about what they had seen and who tried at the end of their lives to be honest about it. The record remains, and it says one thing above all others. The American Marines who fought across the Pacific between 1942 and 1945 were the product of something their enemies never had and never built and never fully understood. An institution that took its work seriously and installed that seriousness inside its men, so completely that they carried it with them into every fight and it never left them. Not on the sandbar at the Tenaru, where Colonel Ichiki learned that spiritual intensity was not enough. Not on the ridge above Henderson Field, where Kawaguchi's men broke against Edson's raiders in the dark. Not on the reef at Tarawa, where William Bordelon walked into 500 yards of fire because he had been trained to. Not in the caves of Peleliu, where Everett Pope came down a hill with the handful of men left after taking it with 9. Not on the black sand of Iwo Jima, where John Basilone came ashore knowing he did not have to and did not come home. Not on the ridges of Okinawa, where Hiromichi Yahara watched the last great fight of the Pacific and, 27 years later, sat down to write. Your father did not tell you what happened on those beaches. Now you know why. Some things a man sees, he cannot bring home in words. He can only carry them in silence. And that silence, kept for 80 years, was the last honor he paid to the men who stood beside him, and to the men who tried to stop them, and could not. Somewhere in America tonight, an old man is sitting in a chair by a window. He is 98 years old. He was on one of those beaches. He does not talk about it. He never has. But if you sit with him quietly and the light is right and the room is still, you will see it in his eye. The thing the Japanese finally understood, the thing that made them lose, the thing his country built inside him so long ago, and that has never left him. Not once, not for 80 years. That is the story. That is what the Japanese saw. And that is what we remember, so that we may never have to build it again.